Hello everyone, today we talk about archaic Roman cavalry. And this is a topic which is very dear to me because here I began to talk about Roman history on the channel, and one of the main goals when I when I talk about this topic is actually to debunk a lot of misconceptions that exist about probably the most famous military machine of the ancient world, at least. I think in popular culture the Romans own a very great place, especially in our Western perception. And indeed, the idea of a modern model, in a certain sense, from a political and military point of view of the Roman Empire, is something that remains quite strongly as of a prejudice in many ways. And I noticed that in this sense, people are very keen on what it's been seen as a stereotype of the Romans, that is essentially the the early Roman military during the Principate, and ignoring a lot of other developments and about the same Roman army previously and after, as if that wasn't really a thing that deserves attention. But relatively to the early Roman times, there is a general misconception, because I noticed that people often lack even the most elementary understanding of defining, for instance, what is Roman, what is Latin, Italian. There is a lot of of general, and I put also myself into this, in a general ignorance about the early Rome, and I think instead that that's the very moment in which the genetic characteristics that made Rome great and made it successful in the centuries to come actually really lay. And at the same time, there is also here a bit of ideology that wants to think that the Romans were born like a state, disciplined with all this kind of moral, incredible morale, and as if their success was done exactly by that, and instead it's mostly a kind of coincidence in many ways of the particular environment of Italy and the Roman society, the Latin culture, and all those things that today we will try to look at, even if in perspective relatively to cavalry. And one of the elements that, according to me, are mostly important and that people tend to forget too often, I believe, is that the Romans weren't born like the Greek city-states with, a very strong political asset. The Romans were actually tribesmen. I mean, the same basis of the Roman institutions were originally the tribes. The Romans, as Latins and Sabines and were just like all the other Italics, essentially a warlike people in many ways. The Romans were citizens, yes, but they weren't really citizens as such at the beginning. Rome was founded much later than the Varronian date, and yet there is this past that is often a mythical past, unfortunately for us, that we cannot really scope historically speaking, that before the city and the citizenship and the idea of, of Rome as a republic, etc., was in fact a monarchy. And it was a very strongly characterized tribal society. And much of the developments of the Roman military, even afterwards, cannot be understood in this perspective. And we cannot pretend that Rome was born as Rome. As a state, as a modern state with a professional military, with this kind of inexplicable moral strength that was emphasized by the same Romans from a certain point onwards, but that really was the process of a much complex past that, as I was saying right now, we don't know really much about. And today we will be talking about the real origins of Rome up to essentially up to the the 5th century BC. So a moment that is not really history, that we cannot understand under the usual historian's tool from from the sources, but we have to read through the lenses of anthropology, history of religion. Obviously, there is archaeology as well, as an historical profile in this sense, but what we are studying is essentially not history, it's myth, because this is how the Romans handed it down to us. And the sources that we have and which talk incidentally about the past are quite recent. We will, here I will quote often Livy, for instance, but we don't have to think that Livy, as a Roman of the 1st century BC, knew that much about the archaic Rome. He surely knew, as most of his cultured citizens, co-citizens, more than we do today, obviously, but they were really a very different society. I mean, these things were happening 500 years before Livy's time, and we don't have to interpret it literally, as many have done, causing the also part of the mistakes and misconceptions that are still very widespread in popular culture. I want to remember in this sense that real Roman history, as history as such, starts basically from the 70s of the 3rd century BC. Everything that is before is not pure invention, it's not pure fantasy. There is a lot of historical truth in it, but it has substantially to be read in a very different fashion and mostly interpreted rather than believed literally from the documentary sources that we have. Many of the great heroes of the ancient Rome, as a matter of fact, didn't exist. Furius Camillus didn't exist. So what we will be doing today is just essentially guessing certain things, or at least speculating if you want, but at the same time reflecting on what we know that, according to me, gives a pretty clear picture of at least the origins of the Roman military and how they were essentially tribal origins, and they had their roots in the old Indo-European military tradition that the Latins and the other Italic peoples shared together with the Celts, the Germans, the Alans, the Lusitanians, the Dacians, etc. And that in fact really have a lot of in common. So we're going to talk about cavalry, as we were saying. Cavalry that also here is always being believed to have been a weakness of the Romans. Well, this is a myth, and one of those myths that you can't justify in any way. First of all, this idea came because obviously Roman society produced mostly infantry armies. And cavalry always remains secondary relatively to the foot troops. But, and this has to be explained obviously from a political, social, economical point of view, and maybe I will address it in a certain way. But the general idea that the Roman cavalry was weak, especially, I think it derives as a prejudice from a very simplified, or better simplifying quote from Polybius that essentially wanted to stress the kind of increase in quality of the Roman cavalry before the Punic Wars, especially before the second. And since we really have a very few sources about this, we just took Polybius like, yeah, he had to know best. So this is the case. The Romans had bad cavalry. This is not true. As a matter of fact, the Roman cavalry was quite strong. The Romans had a very few cavalry. It surely didn't perform decisive roles on the battlefield, because that was the rule in non-feudal societies, like most of the Europeans one were. Maybe just the early Macedonian one being a sort of feudal society that in fact produced quite effective shock cavalry like the one of the companions. But generally speaking, looking at the Celts, looking at the Germans, looking at the Italics, very strong cavalry was definitely existed in some fashions, um, but it wasn't it was expressed in very few numbers, and generally it was present only when there was a lot of wealth accumulating into the hands of a few who could exercise, but more. This is not really the um, this is just for saying that we have to erase, however, from our mindset all the prejudices and stereotypes that we can really have, and start looking at the sources for how we can understand them. So relatively to the earliest Roman cavalry. So as you know, the Romans were born in this sense as very diverse communities coming together in this hilly area and marshy area of the low Tiber Valley in the so-called Latium. By the way, I'm just gonna speak here the pronunciation that of Latin that is known as pronunciatio restituta. We have really no certainty about how the Romans spoke, but seemingly this was the closest that we can trace linguistically and philologically. So if you hear me speaking in pronunciatio restituta, please don't freak out, because I'm trying to be precise here, and otherwise you can still use the ecclesiastical pronunciation that is the most at least, well, no, I believe just in Italy maybe it's the most widespread, but certain people still read it. I see widely in many countries as in the ecclesiastical fashion. So here we'll be talking in Restituta. So the according to myth and legend, so talking about the times of Romulus, that doesn't mean to be understood as a temporal era, but as a mythical era of the very early past of Rome, as it was handed down to historically. Rome, and we can say its citizenship, even if it is something probably very anachronistic at this time, was founded, according to Varro, on the union of three tribes that were famously the Ramnes, the Titius, and the Luceres. So these tribes are meant to reflect traditionally the multi-ethnicity of the Roman identity. Ramnes should be a sort of early wave for Romans. Titius were meant to be Sabines or Sabines, I don't know how you say it. It's better Sabines. And Luceres to be were meant to be Etruscans. As a matter of fact, both the three names seem of Etruscan origin. But this is not important. The important thing is that nowadays the core of Rome was made up by tribesmen, by tribes coming together. Then all this differentiation is something that we know historically that might have been conceived quite much later in time, even in terms of centuries, so don't mind about this temporally. Follow me here on the mythical side of the wall, which is a temporal in many ways. And here, regarding cavalry, the very first thing is said that we know, which is extremely interesting, and that Livy says, is that these three names actually corresponded, according to Livy, because there were different versions already at the time, for making you understand how blurred the whole thing was, also for the same Romans of the Republic, as the three squadrons of cavalry that made up the bodyguard of Romulus. In short, these Ramnes, Titius, and Luceres were sort of horse riders. also known as Celeres, which in Latin means the speedy ones, essentially. And this is already of excruciating importance, because here it's not implying that there wouldn't be infantrymen fighting alongside with these guys. But at the same time, it's very fascinating to think that the Latins that had migrated in Italy from Central or Eastern Europe back in the day, in the first or around the first millennium BC, would be fully Indo-European, obviously, as the Italics were of origin, in spite of intermingling eventually with the pre-Indo-European populations that existed um, in Europe. Um, and that could have a lot of ties to the ancient culture of the steppes, so of nomads or semi-nomads who made extensive use of cavalry. Regarding to this, and maybe to make you understand better what I'm talking about, I made a video which is called The Origins of European Chivalry that explains that, I think, effectively. I want to be good with myself, relatively to the fact that peoples like the Italics, the Celts, the Germans, in spite of all migrating from the Caucasus to the west, at the time being Proto-Indo-Europeans even, they're not differentiated between the actual branches that eventually differentiated in Europe, retained with themselves a great, essentially a military culture that really emphasized the equestrian traditions. And even if these peoples weren't great horse riding peoples, yes, the Celts had like a terrible love for horses, but contrarily-wise to what even the Romans made us think, this is another point, they didn't have such a very strong cavalry. They simply had a lot of cavalry, which is very different. Not having very good collective training at that point. But what's important here is to think, this is just an hypothesis of mine, but I'm quite confident that it's very important that what the Roman sources here were meaning is that basically the very origin, so the guard of Romulus, and Romulus being the first king of Rome originally and the one who had a very strong military characterization in many ways, he was the conqueror and founder of Rome. So we're talking about quite violent times. We know, as a matter of fact, that in Romulian age, the Romans at that point made a lot of raids, and this is interesting with the close Sabine settlements that existed in what technically today is the very center of Rome. So Sabine really started very close, for telling you how Rome gravitated around a very tiny part at this time of the hills, would be actually horsemen. I mean, the idea that this mythical foundation was characterized by these Celeres, these speedy ones that were at least mounted warriors that, as we will be seeing, probably usually fought on foot, dismounting, but still could in any way fight on horseback as well, is an indicator of, according to me, in part of a sort of dream-like idea that these Latins were being essentially still mindful of their ancient nomadic past in some way. Obviously, things are extremely more complicated because, both from a historical and archaeological point of view, we know really nothing about these peoples. As a matter of fact, we don't even know what they were named like, because the Latins didn't give the name to Latium, but it was the other way around. So these peoples had even lost memory of their ancient ethnonym. They had sedentarized, they had mixed with other aristocracies, like this same myths about the ancient Rome actually suggest quite explicitly. But it's still important that at the very origin of the Roman armed forces, which is a bit of an anachronism, but this was essentially bands of thugs, of warriors that went raiding the neighboring villages and so on, there was the idea of mounted warriors. And I think this is of excruciating importance, really, and I can't stress this enough. Then the very first army of Rome that was created around this tribal organization basically developed according to myth, and here you don't have to take numbers literally, over essentially an army that counted 3,000 infantry and 300 cavalrymen. Um, Essentially, every of the three tribes that we named, the Ramnes, the Titius, and the Luceres, was subdivided in 10 political administrative communities called curiae, which means from coviria, which means essentially men, really meant as males, put together in coordination, so it has a very strong even military connotation that it also in here is typical of the semi-nomadism that the Italics still retained at that time of Indo-European origin, and hence there would be in this archaic Rome a sum of 30 curiae, which were essentially stratified with with a sort of aristocracy within them, of clans that existed there, in which there would be the patres, so the fathers, so the elders. This idea of that has nothing really of anagraphic in practice. Sure, there would be mature men who had already had children and stuff, and that had the moral authority and especially the wealth and the prestige to guide the rest of people really at this point gathered around, because Rome was very opened. Probably there wasn't even in actual historical terms anything like a real city, obviously. I mean, it was still very far from the culture of these tribesmen. There would be just tribes aligned with themselves, and the relation between the first of all, these I wanted to add that every curia was subdivided in turn had to give 100 men on foot and 10 men on horseback. Hence, all the 30 would make, as we were saying, 3,000 infantrymen and 300 horsemen. Now, this relation is extremely fascinating to me, because the relation 1 to 10 in terms of cavalry to infantry is really a relation that also in other times of history, in other society, actually suggests a very heavy political and military weight of cavalry. 1 to 10 is the same relation that you find in Italian communes during the low Middle Ages, in the golden age of cavalry, where the so-called milites, the knights in the Italian communes, actually made up the commune in itself and led and made war, and were the ones who actually decided the battles, and the other guys on foot from lower social classes just followed and maybe could just make some defense for a certain while, but surely not being able to meet the enemy on in open field. Obviously that was in the full age of cavalry, so with very heavily cursed soldiers with stirrups, etc. So here it's not really fitting for the ancient world, but still 1 to 10 is a pretty good relation. And especially, it's not a 1 to 10 into which the people rules, and then the 10th of cavalry is made up of guys that are substantially associated to infantry. Here, the cavalrymen were actually the elite of society. So it's what the other guys would actually follow, also in terms of material wealth, and hence of equipment, of possibility of training, of accumulating resources, of redistributing them in the warrior tribal fashion. So I think that all the picture, the bigger picture is the one of an archaic Roman army, into which cavalry had a very heavy weight, not just from a political point of view, but also from a military and hence a tactical point of view. Um, and um, and more to come later. Um, the and the original the 300 cavalrymen would be basically would have three centuriae, would make up three centuriae, so 300 men, centuria being 100 men, and they would have we don't know really how many commanders, where it's a number between 1 and 3, and essentially we can't think in historical terms that this could vary really on the base of politics, of matters how they were, but we can also suggest that these centuriae being essentially as three different bodies also coming from different clans would have their own kind of hierarchical structure independently from the tribune that was put at their command. In fact, the name of these tribunes would be the tribuni celerum, so the tribunes of the speedy ones. Um, and this wall, 3,300 men, would make the very first legion, if we really want to call it this way. Now, as far as we know, and remember here, once again, we are still in a sort of mythical dimension, so we really don't know how it really happened. There would be a progressive transformation of Roman society towards a more popular arrangement. You know that the history of Rome at this point, even in the legend, is marked by obviously later to especially later in time, to the struggle between the patricians and the plebeians, all the, that represents in historical terms all the struggle that lower classes that were evidently growing in a sort of egalitarian fashion, because this was kind of a very primitive society. So Latium being rich enough to feed a lot of people, and these people would make the plebs, in fact, and which was, even when armed, indeed, a danger also for the aristocracy. So there is this great historical macroscopical datum for which Roman society went progressively stratifying, and into which the people started getting also its own aristocracy in turn. So you never have to think like the people of Rome, like the actual everyday guy that was wandering around. Rome has always been an oligarchy, always, and the same plebeians had their own oligarchs. So what we're asking was essentially for their own personal power, and they just didn't think extremely much of the rest of the people. It's all about power. It's not really about making charity most of the times, unfortunately. But as far as we know, there would be other reforms, famously the Servian one of Servius Tullius, but relatively to cavalry, even during at the times of I don't remember whether it should be at the time of Tarquinius Priscus. That is also another mythical. You have to think that, with the exception perhaps of Servius Tullius, all the Roman kings are kind of fictional characters. Surely there were several kings, and not just the 7 ones that are normally named, if anything for anagraphical reasons, because if you look at what the timeline would have to be, these guys would have lived kind of 60 years of reign for each, which is not really very credible. But what is important is that under Tarquinius Priscus were instituted there was a doubling of the 3 cavalry centuriae through the institution of the so-called sex suffragia, that were, in this sense, the suffragium would be a sort of political and voting a community. So here you understand from the tribe we're slowly evolving to something more political. So the sex suffragia would be literally these six district circumscriptions, I don't know you want to call them, that were meant to provide cavalry, and Tarquinius Priscus seemingly doubled them. So there would be still the three old centuriae, the Ramnes, the Titius, and the Luceres, but they were doubled. So there would be the Ramnes Primi and Ramnes Secundi, the Titius Primi and the Titius Secundi, and the Luceres Primi and Luceres Secundi. Without confusing your mind, here we just mean that the Roman cavalry was allegedly doubled. So not the old 300 guys, but 600. By the way, this is the time in which Romans still could recruit just one legion. I mean, the first time two legions were recruited, something that happened later in time when the city expanded, also demographically, economically speaking. So this would make still the whole body of, at least of the Roman proper military. And this is interesting because here you see that cavalry, in spite of time passing, keeps the pace in terms of Rome's development. There is a lot of debate to this because people say, well, but this is probably just mythical, we don't really know. 600 cavalrymen would be also a lot for Rome at that time. Yes, and if we go to the even to the reform of Servius Tullius, that made the famous Servius Tullius is conceived as the kind of the I can't say the second founder of Rome, but definitely that that kind of had a huge impact because he reformed the army and the same society accordingly. So dividing the population, the Roman population, into classes. And this is, in historical terms, is meaning that Rome was expanding at a point and was already very socially stratified, for which there would be a sensual organization in recruitment and debate of personal wealth, etc. But let's stick to cavalry. Basically, Servius Tullius would have tripled the sex suffragia in turn. So we had in practice from 300, then it was horsemen, 600 horsemen under Tarquinius Priscus, and 1800 horsemen under Servius Tullius. So, as I was saying, all the criticism, because people said, well, it's implausible for what we know about Rome at the time of Servius Tullius, that lived, according to legend, in the 6th century, for Rome to have fielded 1800 horsemen. Probably it's something that happened later. There are people who shift this back into ahead in time of almost 2 centuries at the siege of Veii, when Rome could be reasonably fielding such numbers. But as I said, this is not important right now. What we are seeing is reading through these reforms and what they really meant. What is important about the reforms of Tarquinius Priscus and Servius Tullius is that there would be excuse me, just during the ones sticking to the one of Tarquinius Priscus, excuse me, the important thing about the sex suffragia that I forgot to mention is that basically these 600 men who had to provide a horse into battle were practically to provide their horses for their horses and their own equipment on their own. So these guys, these cavalrymen, were called equites equo privato, which in Latin means cavalrymen who have to provide with their own private horse. So in this sense, there was still the original conception that remained even afterwards for a great time of at least up to the Middle Republic. The idea that the Roman soldier had to provide his own equipment for himself, which was considered very important because it would be considered a privilege in the first place to serve in the Roman army. So a true Roman citizen didn't have to care about spending that money because it was a prestige just to be a Roman, and in this sense just to be able to be in a Roman legion and to fight against to fight for Rome against her enemies. Obviously this could happen. We know that in practice probably this was never reality, meaning that there would definitely be a moment in Roman history into which the single Roman citizens could provide on average satisfactorily for their own equipment, but most of the times probably was already some form of centralization with a criterion of redistribution of resources that probably existed still in the age of kings, because basically warrior chiefs um, um, used to do that in every tribal society as well, and you find always a social segmentation for which there is always the poorer and richer, and that makes a very important difference also on the battlefield. But what is important is that and that I find extremely important to exactly to understand the relevance of cavalry in the politics and in the military of Rome in the archaic times, is that when Servius Tullius tripled the number of cavalry, he added so these other 2/3 to Roman cavalry, other 12 centuriae compared to the 6 that existed with the sex suffragia by the form of Tarquinius Priscus, horsemen that whose war horse was paid by the state. These guys were called equites equo publico. So basically at that time it means that in Servian Rome allegedly 2/3 of the Roman cavalry was expensed by the state. You might say, well, what's with that? Well, this is incredibly important because it basically means, and this was the only case in Roman history into which into this original system for which everyone had to provide for his own equipment, that the state paid a horse for someone. And this didn't happen because these guys didn't have enough soldiers to have a horse. Not at all. It wasn't made for the poor aristocrats. This was done, I believe, and I'm strongly convinced of this, like in other times of history, because the same state needed those and the same state was ruled by those horsemen. And I want to make the same comparison here with the Italian communes of the 12th century, where the milites, the knights, de facto ruled the commune, and there would be the so-called equites pro communi that were exactly war horses that belonged to these guys that were paid by the community and the poorer community, so by the commoners, not by the knights, not by these nobles, in order to make the nobles field those horses and to repay them if the horses was damaged and got hurt, and so on. So many people would read the reform of Servius Tullius relatively to the equites equo publico as, you see, here the Romans were so mindful of their democratic traditions, were so brave that they thanked the horsemen by the most courageous ones by paying like a price this horse to them and maintaining the virtue the civic virtue. And no, this is not at all. These were guys that were imposing to the whole community. There was rich guys, nobles, that were imposing to the whole Roman community the expenses for their own horses. And this tells you how this aristocracy of horsemen was extremely strong into the same Rome. So at this time, during Servian times, that are usually remembered as the ones into which a sort of democratic republican asset was founded institutional in its essentials. Then a republic, according to legend, would come later. But essentially, the idea that there is a people that you divide in classes and that participate to the army. Here, the horsemen that represented the aristocracy were still in charge at the top, and the lower classes were so submitted to them because they were too weak, even militarily, to revolt against them, that they had to pay for their own horses, like it happened in the Middle Ages, and that we know much better in this regard. Well, this is what I believe. Really, it is the extremely important thing, and that tells you that ancient Rome had actually gave a huge importance to cavalry, which was reflected very much likely also on the field. The interesting thing is that the state paid for these, or for buying the horses with 10,000 asses. I know it makes it laugh, asses, yeah, but it's still interesting. While for the maintenance of the horses, there would be a tax that was basically paid by the unmarried women of Rome. So a good push for making women making babies, and hence future Roman warriors. And so the if you reflect on this, I mean, I'm sure that this is the right interpretation, because it's really so convincing in many ways. I know I shouldn't reason like that when talking about history, but I've seen it too well in other periods in history that I studied, and I cannot say but that this is the moment in which not the proud legion of infantrymen, of Roman soldiers, was created. On the contrary, this was the readjustment of um, a, um, an oligarchy that was carried out at expenses of the lower classes that fought on foot, while the aristocrats fought largely on horseback and were still probably determining into battles, into warfare in many ways. Not much because of the cavalry itself, probably, but mostly because they were wealthier and could afford better equipment. But still, the Roman people at this time wasn't so strong to have that core army of infantrymen that at a certain point re-equilibrated the political balance towards a shift towards the popular classes during the clash between patricians and plebeian. So this cavalry reform in Serbian times means this, according to me. Um, um, and I would like to add another thing that I will talk about that into detail in another occasion. But the Roman cavalry actually was always, from the sources that we have, quite out there. I mean, there are countless examples in Roman history of this archaic period into which the Romans appear to be fighting on horseback, especially aristocrats, and into which we have a great emphasis on the individual skill of these warriors that is typical of tribal societies. For instance, before the Battle of Suessa, that was something that is very late in time, um, during actually the wars, the Latin wars, um, in one of the few battles into which the actually the Romans and the Samnites fought together against the fought together in the first place. So we are in 343 BC. So something very late, a moment into which, by the way, the Manipular religion was about to develop, or was already being tried um, by the Romans. There is the story of, I can't go in detail now, but there is definitely a story that tells you that the Romans gave an extreme importance to the idea of warrior bravery, of the guy fighting on horseback. There is a duel on horseback, as a matter of fact, between a Roman and a Latin cavalryman. The Roman wins. Then he gets beheaded, though. He gets beheaded because he was the son of the consul Decius Mus, who had strictly forbidden to engage the enemy without order, and the consul makes his son beheading in front of the whole army because he had disobeyed, and the Romans won eventually. And this tells you one thing, according to me. I always like to quote this because it's very meaningful, that the Romans weren't born as disciplined soldiers. They were born as warriors. And what they achieved eventually with the Manipular legion, that you can call as Chameleon or as Polybian, but really there was a very long development of the same Manipular legion. It's not that the Romans invented the Manipular legion from a day to another. It took centuries before the maniples were fully organized as the standard Roman military organization of the legions. They had to struggle like hell to deprive the same Romans and the allies, the Italic allies that were coming to fight alongside with them, of the warrior indiscipline. And this was a very tough task, and as the case of Decius Mus and his son proves, because a consul of Rome basically beheaded his own son, because that son represented the average Roman warrior that wanted still to behave like an individual, like to fight and give a military prowess, in a moment in which the Romans instead were struggling to create a disciplined army. And that's also part of the mythical past, in the sense that we don't know whether these events really happened. But what remained in Roman history of these hints is extremely clear. The Romans were warriors, like all the Indo-European peoples. They were meant to fight as warriors, and this was a terrible problem for an expanding state like the one of Rome, because a state like that requires a professional army, a disciplined army, not a band of warriors that fight for their own prestige and the prestige of Rome. Have you ever guessed why the Romans were so keen on this idea of the duty, of discipline, of obedience? It's because it's a Freudian thing, because they had completely failed at the beginning. They couldn't make it, and they had to impose very Spartan methods to achieve that result, and it took really ages. Yet they were also very clever enough not to delete that warlike character from their own soldiers, because the Roman legionaries were disciplined, yes, but they were also individually minded. They fought in unit, but they fought also as one, and they kept this really. And however, between the individual skilled soldier and the disciplined soldier that has to work in formation, even if he's less skilled individually, it's the disciplined formation that wins over the warriors. And this is how the Romans conquered the world. And they managed to do that because unlike others, let's say, I don't want to now create problems, unlike others, they had been warriors as well, and they perfectly knew that, so they had learned it the hard way. And that kind of warrior ethics had incorporated this idea of cavalry that was all one with the ancient Indo-European aristocracy that fought on horseback. You find that in all the other Indo-European cultures. Even in the myths of Rome, there is always the horse that recur, just like in the Greek mythology, because they all came from the same cauldron of the Caucasian steppes. Well, when were all fought on horseback, and these guys remember it back in the day. Even if they had sedentarized, even if they had kind of civilized, um, that seducing model, instinctive model of the single warrior that achieves the great deeds and is prized by the whole community was still there, and yet it was something, uncompatible with a professional army, with a disciplined army, with an army that had to respond to a state, not to an aristocracy, and they had to obey. Point, not to reason with your own mind. Frederick II of Prussia used to say, if my soldiers had a brain or something like that, I wouldn't have an army, essentially. and the Prussian armies were quite a hell of armies. So just for saying how the discipline wins over, let's say, individual instincts in many ways. Discipline wins over instincts, even over courage sometimes. Most of the times, if you have courage and discipline, and you have brutality and courage, then discipline is gonna win. And for saying that, it's not the Roman legionaries eventually became, less courageous than the warriors they were in the past. Actually, well, yeah, you can state that, because it's really how it happened. It was. From in terms of an individual prowess, definitely the tribal societies, also the Celts of the Germans, remained individually better warriors. But the Romans won over them because they managed to beat them where they wouldn't work, like on organization, on collective training, discipline. That's it, and that's how it still is in military affairs. And this is what I want to leave you with before we go. Actually, reading some quotes from history about the effective use of cavalry at this archaic stage. That is the idea that the Romans initially were extremely, very much keen on cavalry, and they had pretty of a good cavalry. By the way, also the Etruscans had seemingly, especially in earlier times, very prized cavalry. And you know that Rome was created institutionally as sort of copy of an Etruscan city. The Etruscans being quite similar, having a very good cavalry that was seemingly their pride. Then eventually this cavalry seemingly declined over time. When the Romans conquered Etruria, they seemingly this cavalry doesn't appear very much. But just for saying that here, even the very close relation between between Rome and its foundation and Etruscan society can really explain in part also that. And we definitely find a lot of indications that these guys fought among aristocrats on horseback sometimes. If not dismounting from horse, but they all had a horse and they were quite skilled horsemen. The name of we've seen the centuriae as these centuries essentially of cavalrymen. That was the military and administrative division, and also a political one, because they were political. They reflected the clans of origin. However, on the tactical level, the cavalry units were framed into the so-called ally, which really means the wings. A very poetic way of calling it. Gellius, quoting certain words of Quincus, explains the etymology in this way. They're called ally because they flank the legion on the left and on the right and on the left, just as the wings on the body of the birds. There is a fundamental question that maybe has to be answered: is how effective really this cavalry was on battlefield. Like, we know that even from archaeology, from everything we really can know about Indo-European societies once they settled in Europe, yeah, that most of the armies would be made up still numerically of infantrymen. So, um, given the political preeminence of the knights in the Roman army, how effective was really this cavalry on the battlefield? Because in the ancient world, basically, we know that cavalry weren't so developed, like in the feudal societies, in order to actually win battles against infantry alone. They were normally used to flank the enemy, but the main core of the army, also in terms of tactical balance, would be made up by the infantry that made the full body of the full, the greater part of the army's strength. Well, probably at this stage, I suggest that cavalry was definitely stronger than that. Surely it wasn't a very heavy shock cavalry like we can imagine, a companion cavalry, like that's maybe the only exception in the sedentarized West at that point. Um, Definitely Roman society wasn't a feudal one. We have seen that, yes, the aristocrats had a lot of power, originally speaking, and they would have land estates, but Latin society was still relatively primitive and Latium enough rich to satisfy at a medium level a broader quantity of people who could effectively serve on infantry on foot. I mean, as infantrymen. So this mass of people eventually kind of stamped the overdevelopment of the Roman aristocracy and didn't make Rome evolve into a feudal society. So it's at that point that infantry, also in there, probably kind of stopped in the tactical balance, the preeminence of cavalry, relegating it in kind of a secondary role. But I suggest that at the beginning of this stage, cavalry would be quite effective. This cavalry is charged, like all the cavalries of the ancient world. It doesn't matter that they didn't have stirrups, nor saddles, probably, even in certain cases. These guys would have pretty steel thikes, I believe, because that's how you hold yourself on horseback. And they would be definitely able to fight on horseback. But like in many other times of for instance, of the era of the migration, that is, this sense was similar to the one of the Indo-European migration. It would be normal for these warriors to kind of jump on horseback and just jump down on foot interchangeably. And in fact, we understand from historical sources that this was really the case. I mean, the guys would arrive on horseback on the battlefield, and then they would dismount and fight on foot. This is something that you find widespread basically in every Indo-European society at this time, in tribal. In a tribal context, but also not just in that. Also because you have to think that for these tribes that really made up the greatest part of Europe at this time, the Greek cities being a sort of copy of the Mesopotamian political models, being an exception in this sense, here Europe being still very even homogeneous and still not extremely diversified culturally speaking. You find that the fighting on horseback was considered a kind of cowardice, because the idea was that you could flee at any moment if things started to get rough. So the true warrior, this is you find even in the Celtic society, with the chariots that brought soldiers into the midst of battle, and they jumped down the chariot and started fighting on foot, and then the chariot passing by and taking them up again. And this is the same that would happen with horses. Um, so, um, but this doesn't mean that they weren't skilled horse fighters as well. There is the endless debate about Anglo-Saxon cavalry in early medieval history, being sources stating that essentially the Anglo-Saxons didn't fight on horseback because their tradition was to dismount and then fight. But we know that the Anglo-Saxons went to war on horse, and it would be kind of stupid to pretend that they couldn't fight on horseback. It's definitely an approximation that we can't accept just because the source tells us otherwise. It's not that sources state the truth. You have to interpret them, and we know that it would be pretty normal in a tribal society to behave in this way. And we have many, as in the case of Decius Mus, many, um, I don't know how to say that, say there were many proof, at least from documentary sources, that this was the case. At the same time, I believe that infantry was probably also quite tough, in the sense that if infantry is made up also, and the cream of infantry is made up also by the same dismounted warriors that are aristocrats and most likely even have very heavy armor, like we know they had from archaeology, um, probably even the same armies mm, wouldn't still see a certain time this kind of conventional use of cavalry that you find especially in Hellenistic warfare in a full tactical sense, like with bodies of cavalry that had to move here and there and attack. Of course it would happen, but it probably was on a smaller scale, also because these societies were quite small, even demographically speaking. So probably these battles were probably more staged and ritualized in some cases, especially the pitched battles, as always. And yet, most of the warfare was still made up, like in old times in history, by these kind of skirmishes and ambushes and raids and stuff like that, into which cavalry is crucial, is fundamental. So probably we don't really have to look at cavalry as in this sense as a full. We have also to think of the distrust that aristocracy had towards the people. I mean, these guys who were warriors, and they really felt in their mind like to be the best people on earth, and those who were below socially were kind of scum point. So the way they would even interact in military affairs was quite cocky, quite individual, quite quite exhibitionist even sometimes. Everybody at this time praised the single military deed, the hero, the situation, etc. And this is also the time of the so-called heroic phase that you find even in the Hellenic of the so-called Hellenic Middle Ages. I mean, the idea that there is this hero, like in the Iliad, that is like the only one that fights alone. This is kind of very ideal in many ways, because we know that probably this has never been the real model in actual fact. There would always been someone, there was probably always someone behind the warrior, like throwing stones or javelins or protecting him on the flanks, also because these guys were very heavy loaded um, uh, by um, by the armor that at this time would be very heavy. This kind of full body plate armor on the chest, and very closed helms that even made took away a lot of visual, etc. So that would be the function, a bit like in the medieval, in the Middle Ages, with the full great helm and the squires that literally told their masters, look right, look left, because behind them during the battle, because this is how it really happened. And I suggest that this form of interaction is still very far from the idea of the discipline and array of the Roman legion and stuff. There definitely would be a Roman line of battle. There definitely would be staged battles into which cavalry had a very important role tactically in hitting in en masse and charging like with a collective effort. Yet collective training and complex maneuvering was something very far for what we can practically know, and things would be a bit more messy and spontaneous than we can imagine. Many people say also that at this time the Roman legion, especially with Servian reforms, was kind of a copy of the Greek phalanx. Well, if you have any book that tells you that the Romans had a copy of the Greek phalanx, you can throw that book in the bin because it's worth nothing. And this is one of the greatest prejudices and stupid historical errors that still are so widespread in popular culture. The fact that the Romans had various classes of guys that fought in a more or less thick, compact formation doesn't legitimate anyone to say that the Romans copied the Greek phalanx, because the Greek phalanx, of hoplitic phalanx, I'm not talking about the Hellenistic pikemen phalanx, was something that was peculiar only to the Greek motherland. Even in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, the phalanx was already something different, and it died out quite rapidly. In the Roman world, in Latium, and also in the other areas of Italic Italy, um, um, also in among the Etruscans, that are also credited to have had a sort of Greek phalanx-like army. There was absolutely nothing like that. These were simply ordered formation with a compact front, like just the Celts had, like just the Germans had, just like the Celtiberians had. That definitely even adopted Greek equipment sometimes, but they definitely hadn't the same compactness. They didn't have the same social segmentation, and especially they were made up by warriors, not by citizens. They were made up by guys who who fought on the base of clans, who disregarded order and discipline, and thought just about their own prestige. This obviously changed in Roman history, but it didn't change towards the direction of a Greek hoplitic phalanx. If anything, the Romans eventually invented the maniple. So this idea of a Roman phalanx is kind of naive, and it has to be rethought and reconsidered, because the Roman hoplitic phalanx, the Greek hoplitic phalanx, is something extremely specific to Greek society, and it's not been replicated elsewhere with the same real characteristics. The Roman legion being much more disordered, made up of, um, of warriors, as we say, not citizens. It would see the widespread involvement of javelins, of heavy javelins, of individual fighters, something that you couldn't fight in Greece in any way. Even the Spartans, who were more versed into individual combat, had nothing to do with an Italic, a Celtic, or a Germanic warrior, individually speaking. They would beat the hell of the single Spartan. Then in formation, not, because the Spartans at that point were strong exactly for that reason. So never stress the comparison like, the Romans were a copy of the Greeks. No, they weren't. They've never been. And the reason why they've never been is that they've conquered the world and they kept it. And they did it through their own army. So now after this event that I find quite interesting, I should definitely make a video about it to explain it better, because there are so many misunderstandings and errors that you find written everywhere on the internet, and I don't know where people get this from. I mean, if you don't know things, don't tell them, don't write them, don't let other people being infected with with your own speculations, because that's false. And now we have a generation of people who believes that the Romans had the Greek hoplitic phalanx. No, they didn't. For now, I would like to close with some quotes from from about Roman cavalry from Roman sources. Um, we know evidence from Livy 220 that in 499 BC the Roman dictator Postumius ordered the horsemen to descend from horses and to attack the Latins in first line, in the front line. Always Livy 362 in 449 BC. The cavalrymen of two Roman legions that were at this point, if the numbers are right from the sources, 600, they descended from their horses. The Latin expression is ex aequis desiliunt, which means they literally descended from their horses. And they basically joined the Roman infantrymen against the Sabines in the fight. And only when they beat the Sabines, they mounted back on horseback, and they pursued the fleeing enemies. So this is very interesting. I mean, the Roman cavalry at this point descended to fight on foot. Together with the Roman infantrymen, they beat the enemy, and then they came back on foot to pursue the enemy. This is kind of rough in the sense that normally heavy cavalrymen would be even for sometimes these sources maybe are not very specific. They're just approximating a little thing, because when you have heavy infantry that can fight heavy cavalry, normally that's kind of elite, and they usually stay in reserve. They intervene at the very last moment of the battle to reverse the most dangerous situation with their shock and impact. Now, if these guys had the strength to fight on foot, which is fine, because maybe they had more of a they were more skilled, more effective to fight on foot at that point. Maybe the terrain obliged them. And they would still be kind of elite, so very heavily loaded with armor and all. Well, a fight is something that exhausts you. So even having the strength of coming over a horse that, by the way, is loaded with your own weight is something not extremely realistic if the consequence is you to pursue the enemy, because normally the enemy is pursued by very light cavalry at that point. But here probably the whole thing suggests that the average of the fighter involved on both sides was pretty much lightly armored, because it's not that these guys were all loaded in armor like in later Roman times. So maybe this kind of cavalry was a kind of medium one, so guys who were decently armored, decently protected in any way, and still being capable of being light enough as cavalry to pursue an enemy after a fight. But in any case, it tells you that these were probably quite high quality troops that had a great individual resistance, and that's the warriors I was talking about before. Then Livy, once again, Livy 438, in 423 BC, the Decurion Sextus Tempanius. The Decurion would be the commander of the Decuria. As a matter of fact, that was the equivalent of the Centuria. The Centuria would be 100 men on foot. The Decuria, from which Decurion was instead 10 guys on horseback, and the Decurion would be the officer that commanded them. The Decurion Sextus Tempanius, so he's a Roman, invited the comrades to descend from horseback and to follow the point of his spear as a sort of flag to get through the enemies. Now this is very important too. Armed with parma. The parma is a small round shield, and by this action essentially uh, getting victory while the outcome of the battle seemed very uncertain. So here we have a very precious um, story, because it basically says that the situation in the battle was kind of, nobody, it was very tense, because the outcome could was still uncertain. So a decisive action was needed, and the guy who was a cavalryman orders the other fellow, a cavalry commander, an officer, to he orders his other horsemen to descend from horseback and to charge into the enemy on foot, so not on horseback. This is very important. And following him by following his own spear that he evidently was pointing up to be seen like touristic guides do. So it's interesting because these guys seem to be an elite, because they get straight into the melee, into the enemies. Here the Roman source says literally getting through the enemy. So it's kind of fascinating. These were kind of elite troops, and however, we have other later witnesses of a more staged and tactical participation of cavalry as detached unit and functioning as cavalry. In 385, this is Livy 6:12. In 385 BC, the dictator Cornelius Cossus gave the following instructions to the Magister Equitum, who was the master of horses, or better, master of horsemen, Quinctius Capitolinus. He told him, keep your cavalry still in wait for the melee to begin, the battle to begin. And when you'll see the arrays already engaged in hand-to-hand fighting, then spread terror with the horsemen among those men that are already caught by another fear, by throwing your horsemen to the charge and break the line of the fighters. This is also very fascinating. Here it's a bit later. You might argue that maybe at this time the cavalry was being used not much of a more of an instrument for a few aristocrats to act individually on the battlefield, but as a more with a better tactical coordination with infantry. So it says to cavalry, wait, that the battles just began, and then hit on the enemy, probably on the flanks or in the rear when they're already fearful of the outcome of the battle with our infantrymen. So I'd say that unfortunately we don't know much more about Roman cavalry in this sense. Now I kind of gave you a bit of a positivistic opinion regarding the matter, but we can say that we can presume that the Roman cavalry in these centuries, between the 7th, the 8th century to the 6th, the 5th, even the 4th, was probably quite, didn't see a lot of change, didn't see a lot of evolution. If anything, we can spot this progressive transfer from this progressive shift from a warrior edicts, organization, social preeminence to something more framed into society, something more acting better in better coordination with the rest of the fighters, also with a rise definitely of the effectiveness of infantry, also and politically of the classes that were expression of it. But it still means a lot that these cavalrymen would be so present at this stage of Roman history, and it really tells you, according to me, how still the warrior ethics was still rooted and very present into Roman warfare at that time, and how mindful we have to be relatively to this, and never think the Romans were born taught, that were born disciplined, they were born ordered, they were born as a state, they were born as, oh yeah, they're the state, the republic, the unity. No, these were tribal societies that came to dwell into a very prosperous land like the lower Tiber Valley is, to get together as a group of tribes that had each own their own interests, but they understood that if united they were stronger. And this is already a very important genetic character of Roman culture and society. And into which very progressively the warrior ethics was kind of compressed and kind of confined into its into a secondary role, but very progressively. In these first centuries, um, warriors that fought or went to war at least on horseback were definitely the spearhead of the Roman army, as we have seen also from other from certain sources, and it would still remain very deeply rooted into the Roman army, this kind of individual prowess, this kind um, of warrior cockiness that was detrimental, however, to collective discipline at the beginning, and against which the Romans eventually fought quite harshly. So, yeah, I think for now it is all. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a comment or subscribe to my channel for receiving news from my upcoming videos. And for now, I thank you heartily, as always, for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!